TV, only on C-SPAN 2.
"35 minutes left in this program. We're going to talk now with Dr. Jay Geed, who is a child psychiatrist with the National Institute of Mental Health, joining us live from Bethesda, Maryland. Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Talk to us about the NIMH approach to childhood mental disorders. What do you study over there?
Well, any parent of a teenager can tell you that the brain of a 13-year-old is very different than the brain of an 8-year-old. But to actually pin down those differences in a scientific way has been elusive. The brain is wrapped in a tough, leathery membrane surrounded by a protective motive fluid and then completely encased in bone. And that has shielded the brain from falls or attacks from predators, but it's also shielded the brain from a scientist. And the new technologies to look at the brain, such as MRI or magnetic resonance imaging, now allow us to get exquisitely accurate pictures of the growing brain and without the use of radiation. And this has launched a whole new era of adolescent neuroscience where we can now follow brain development in healthy and in ill children.
As we talk about adolescents and kids, what specific type of mental disorders are most prevalent in kids?
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is the most common thing that child psychiatrists see, accounting for about 40% of all of our outpatient visits. Also very common are learning disorders, particularly reading disabilities, but other things such as anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and even schizophrenia may also occur in childhood or the teen years.
Talk to us more about your role at NIMH, doctor. How do you go about your research of these disorders in adolescents and children?
Well, we think that many of these most severe disorders represent deviations from normal brain development. And in order to understand the deviations from normal development, we had to understand normal development. And so about half of our work is actually spent studying healthy children and adolescents to try to map out how the brain is supposed to unfold. And by comparing same age and sex subjects that have ADHD or schizophrenia to healthy children, we can see which areas of the brain are alike and which areas of the brain are different. And this may then suggest further treatments or interventions to help these children.
I want to invite viewers to phone in with their questions and comments on the National Institute of Mental Health, and we're going to focus on childhood mental disorders in this segment. If you live in the East, it's 585-3880. 202 is the area code. If you live out west, 585-3881. And mental health workers, you're invited to call in this segment as well. 202-585-3882. Dr. Jay Geed is child psychiatrist with the National Institute of Mental Health. Doctor, talk to us about girls versus boys and younger kids versus older kids when it comes to these mental disorders.
Well, the difference between boys and girls is fascinating, even though overwhelmingly the brains are way more alike than different. And in fact, even after over 3,000 scans from our studies, I can't look at an MRI scan and say if it's a boy or a girl. But having said that, the group averages are quite different between boys and girls. It's very similar to height. It's true to say that men, on average, are taller than women. If you take 100 men randomly selected and 100 women randomly selected, the average of the men will almost always be taller. But there are so many women taller than so many men that it's not a good way to tell the sexes apart. And this is what we see in our studies, that almost all of the disorders are more common in boys. Except for anorexia nervosa, which is more common in girls, and elective or selective mutism, which is a tie. But most of the illnesses that we study have different ages of onset between boys and girls, different prevalences, different symptomatology. So we're very intrigued by the differences between healthy boy and girl brains and how that might interact with society influences or genetics or other biology factors to account for these differences that we see clinically.
Doctor, you mentioned... I'm sorry, go ahead, doctor.
The differences between the young and the old has really been an unfolding story. When we first began the studies, we were very surprised that by age 6, the total size of the brain is already over 90% that of an adult. And so we were expecting any of the changes that occurred between childhood, the teen years, and adult years to be creeping along at almost at glacial type of speeds, barely changing a few percentage points. But now that we've been able to actually follow the same children by having them come back at 2-year intervals, we see that although the total size is pretty constant, the interior changes in the brain are very dynamic. The brain is very plastic. The changes are occurring much more rapidly than we had ever anticipated.
Calls for Dr. Jay Geed. Tampa, Florida, you're up first. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'm calling because my husband on his side of his family has a niece who is bipolar, and possibly his brother, who is now deceased, was bipolar, and I am bipolar. And I was calling about the genetics of bipolar in childhood. What part does it play? And how do you determine in a child what the symptoms of bipolar might be?
Thanks. Doctor.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the most burning controversies in my field of child psychiatry, particularly overlap between bipolar disorder and ADHD, and whether we're misdiagnosing children in either direction. And it's an important question because in childhood depression or anxiety, the treatments are quite similar in terms of the medicines chosen. But in children, the treatments for bipolar disorder don't work well for ADHD, and the treatments for ADHD don't work well for bipolar disorder. So it's very important to be able to correctly identify them. The trouble is that in children, they don't tend to have the mania and depression as separate periods lasting long periods of time. It's so-called chronic rapid cycling. And some people think that then it can't be bipolar because bipolar means two poles and implies you have to have a high period and a low period. But when we talk to adults who clearly have bipolar as adults, when they were children, they didn't have these distinct periods, that it was more of these mixed states. And so a lot of investigation is being done on how we can identify bipolar disorder early. And the adult criteria that are in the textbooks aren't very helpful. One of them is, had they been married more than 4 times? How many 10-year-olds have been married even twice? It's not a useful criteria. Or have they maxed out more than 3 credit cards? Those sort of criteria just aren't useful for children. And so we need to try to identify a different set of criteria, I think, for children, particularly younger children, and for teens, and perhaps for adults, to help us sort this out. The genetic influence is well recognized, but not that well understood in terms of the specifics. Which gene or group of genes are contributing to the bipolar disorder? Are there different types of bipolar disorder? But you've hit upon, I think, one of the hottest areas of child psychiatry research in terms of how to identify and treat bipolar disorder in children. Because the statistics are very sobering in terms of how long that people have bipolar as an adult. They go without getting treatment. And they can...
Sorry to jump in there, Doc. I thought you were finished.
Yeah, it's often between 5 and 10 years before people have had the symptoms that they actually get treatment, which is way too long.
Doctor, we'll move on to Sacramento, California. Go ahead, Sacramento.
Hi, I was wondering, is it genetic? Because I have, my children have an aunt who is bipolar, and I was wondering what are the chances of my children, who are both boys, of getting bipolar, and that's my question.
Dr. Gee, do you study whole families at a time, by the way, Doctor?
Yes, for many of the diagnostic groups that we're studying, it's very important to identify brothers and sisters and other family members. That can be a strong link to underlying the genetics. And of course, the best of all is twins, in terms of if one of the twins has bipolar disorder and the other one doesn't, or if they're identical or non-identical twins, that can be very informative from a genetic standpoint. If you have family members who have bipolar disorder, the odds are greater than average that your relations will have that as well. But the odds are still overwhelmingly in your favor that they will not. So the lifetime risk for bipolar disorder is between 1% and 2%. If you have close family members, that risk goes up, but it's nowhere near 50%.
We go to Atlanta. Good morning, Atlanta. You're on with Dr. Jay Geed. Hello.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'm a mental health worker, and I work with children, and I'm very concerned about the overdiagnosis of attention deficit disorder and teachers telling parents that their children need to be on Ritalin before they can come back to the classroom. I'm very upset about this, and I realize that a lot of these children are suffering from anxiety or depression or stress or even chemical sensitivities. And I'm seeing that there's a lot of pressure to put children on medication so that they can be compliant in the classroom. And I think that there needs to be a lot more education about different ways of treating attention deficit disorder so that children aren't just being put on medication, that they're looking at a lot of different areas like parenting techniques and chemical sensitivities. Like I know that a lot of schools are requiring these little plug-in air fresheners right now in the classrooms, and I know that many children are very sensitive to these things, and there's a lot of things in the environment, plus the stress that children are under. And maybe a child is coming from a one-parent family and they've been in daycare for most of their lives, and they don't have attention deficit. They may be very angry children that need to learn how to deal with their emotions more adequately. So I'd just like you to address that, please.
Caller, thanks. Dr. Geet, how does NIMH reach out and educate around the country on this?
Again, another key topic that has generated a lot of passionate debate on both sides of this question in terms of, are we overdiagnosing children? Are we underdiagnosing children? And we usually say yes to both, that there are many children that are being diagnosed that don't have ADHD, and there are many that have ADHD and are not being diagnosed. And if it's not ADHD, what is it? Is it stress at home, anxiety, depression? And we'd like to try to focus on one aspect of ADHD, and that's the biology of it. How are the ADHD brains different than the brains of children without ADHD? And what are the effects of the medicines on those children? And in properly diagnosed children, it's a very tough position for parents to be in, because with any medicine, there may be risks to use of those medicines on brain development. But the most recent data published by Dr. Javier Castellanos just last year, October 2002, indicates that there may be risks to not using medicines in properly diagnosed children, in the sense of children who had ADD and had never received medicines actually have more pronounced brain changes in some areas. And the risk of non-treatment could include up to a threefold risk of substance abuse. And so parents are in an awkward situation where they have to make an important decision about whether or not to use medicine, and with not enough data to help them guide the decision. And we often run into this problem of wanting to know the answer. We want to know what these medicines are doing to children. But it's very difficult to study these questions in children, because can they provide informed consent? What if something happens 20 years down the road? And so it's a great challenge, I think, for scientists and for society at large. How do we balance doing studies that benefit children, but at the same time protecting the children while we're doing the studies?
Moving on to Haymarket, Virginia for Dr. Geet. Hello.
Hi, my name is Beth Full. My son was involved in the Dr. Schwartz murder in Loudoun County, Virginia. He played a very small role, but everyone, I believe every kid who was involved in that had mental health history. The one who actually committed the murder had an extensive mental health history. And my question, I guess, is several-fold. One, does someone who suffers from bipolar disorder or schizophrenic disorder, as Kyle Holbert did or does, can that affect whether or not they are aware of the consequences of what they do? And such as, I'm thinking particularly of the football player who, I don't know his name, but I heard about it from someone else, who actually didn't show up. He was a quarterback and he didn't show up for the game, and really didn't know what he was doing. So my question there is can a person really be held responsible? And should the judicial system, which I think is terrible in recognizing the the effects of mental illness on people. I think we're backwards in that area.
Thanks.
Very backwards.
We get the point, Dr. Geed.
Yes, and this is an area that receives a lot of attention in terms of accountability and responsibility, and recognizing that the vast majority of people with mental illnesses are not committing crimes and are as likely to be a victim of crimes as perpetrators. But I think that it often becomes a focus in terms of children that may have mental health issues. Are they less able to control their impulses? Are they suffering from inability or difficulty in separating reality from fantasy? When that line is crossed, does that lead to troubles? And the trouble is, it's a very multi-determined sort of thing. There are so many factors that go into a person's behavior. Some of them so-called hardware changes in their neuroanatomy, their neurochemistry, that might make them more difficult to control impulses or make certain decisions. But many of the factors are more what we'd consider software issues. The hardware works okay, but from a lifetime of experiences and rewards and punishments, that the instructions of life are such that they lead to these unfortunate outcomes. But there is definitely a relationship, but the relationship needs a lot more work to understand what we can do as parents or teachers, or society, to recognize when the risks and dangers are there and when to intervene and how to intervene.
Doctor, talk to us about the cost of drugs for these childhood mental disorders. Does insurance cover most of these problems?
It varies by different region of the country in terms of insurance coverage for the medicines. Often the newer developed medicines are more expensive, in part to recuperate the costs of research and development, and so that it's easier to use the older drugs that are cheaper. And sometimes the improvements are not worth the cost difference, but oftentimes they are. For instance, we think for the longer-acting stimulant medicines for ADHD, the benefits do outweigh the cost difference in terms of taking a medicine once a day and is much easier than 3 times a day, and they don't have to take the medicines in the school setting, and there are fewer peaks and valleys. But for other medicines, there may be a very minor difference or even no difference for a greatly increased cost. But in the child world, the cost of the medicines usually pales in comparison to the cost of special services in school or inpatient hospitalizations. And so it's not as often the main factor for mental health professionals.
San Diego, California, thank you for waiting.
Yes, I'd like to say good morning to the doctor from California, and I'd like to ask him. At 41, I'm a bipolar, and they gave my daughter, they diagnosed my daughter, and in school they started giving her the pills. And, well, when I talked to her, she said, "Oh, don't worry, Dad, all my friends do it." And I'd like to know how the doctor feels about the fact that we're lining up all our kids at lunchtime at the nurse's office and feeding them pills, considering that our society has a lot of drug addicts. I'll take my answer off air. Thank you.
Yeah, and question of large numbers of children receiving medicines in school, and are we overdoing it, or are we just recognizing children that were there in the past and we were just not picking it up? And there again, I think that for many of the children, the medicines are helpful and can be very safe and effective, but that there can also be a tendency to have a quick fix. That it's much easier for us doctors and other mental health professionals to kind of maybe count on those pills a little bit too much to deal with very complicated life issues. And so the issue of use, overuse, underuse, a lot of times it's that same mixture in terms of some children who need the medicines are not getting them, some children who shouldn't be getting them are. But it comes back again to how little research has been done, how little we know about the medicines in children, and how to try to bridge that gap between actually doing the studies to figure this out instead of having to guess and say, well, it did this in adults, it'll probably do this in teens, I'm not sure about children. And we have to do better than that. We have to actually get the information about how these medicines might react differently in children, in teenagers, and adults.
15 minutes left with our guest, Dr. Jay Geed, child psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Geed, over at NIMH, what's been the single biggest breakthrough, the most encouraging thing in these past couple of years in this area?
I think from the brain imaging standpoint, it has been how incredibly plastic and adaptable the brain is. And instead of sort of being set in stone at age 5 or 6, like some of the Jesuit teachings and stuff in terms of give me a child and then by age 5 I can make them a scholar or a priest or criminal, those sort of things, doesn't appear to be holding true from the neurobiology aspect. That one of the most amazing features of the brain is its ability to adapt and change. So the same brain that we used for living on the savannah and hunting and gathering berries, and we're now using to program computers and do all these very different things. And the only way that it could be pulled off was to have a lot of flexibility in the brain. There's just not enough room in the genetic code to account for all the different things that we humans do. And this enormous adaptability and flexibility is very optimistic from my role as a clinician, in the sense that through the teen years there's this enormous ability to turn things around, to change the functioning and even the anatomy of the brain in terms of the connections and pathways that are reinforced. And I think this idea of the ability to make changes much throughout development, not just in children, but through older children and teens, and even on into young adulthood, has been very encouraging to us.
Let's go to Amarillo, Texas. Welcome.
Yes, good morning. I really appreciate C-SPAN. I particularly appreciate the subject of this morning's discussion. I'm a mental health counselor. I have a private practice that's focused primarily on moderate to low-income children and adolescents. And I've been doing this for 10 or 15 years. One of the comments I wanted to make was that I've had a lot of ambivalence about the diagnosis of bipolar in children, mainly because most of the children that I've worked with that have been previously diagnosed by psychiatrists as bipolar usually would turn out that they were or had been victims of sexual abuse, physical abuse, and so on. And that a lot of times their symptoms were exacerbated by undiagnosed ADHD. The other comment I would like to make is that I do believe all this research is very, very valuable. But what I see is, on a state and a federal level, a real lack of commitment to providing services for children. And I want to give the example of here in Texas, as of September 1st of this year, the Children's Health Insurance Program will no longer reimburse for outpatient therapy for children. That's my comment, and thanks again for the wonderful coverage of this subject.
Thanks. Doctor, can you speak more about the federal role versus the state and local, as that caller brought up?
Yes, I think that there were a lot of very well-meaning efforts to focus on the first 3 years of life and interventions and education for those early years, and I totally support those efforts. But what has happened is that the years after 3 have really been not paid as much attention, and in terms of how important that the time that the teens are spending and whether they have healthy activities and outlets, I think we're not doing a very good job of providing lots of healthy and safe activities for teens after school, and as well as things like outpatient therapy. I think it's, in a sense, short-sighted in terms of the plasticity in the brain, and these interventions early on could save the person enormous pain and suffering, and could save society enormous amounts of money to intervene early and well. And it seems like that message hasn't gotten through, that the first 3 years of life are very important, but so are the next 16 and the next years after that. that there is no kind of one magic age when we need to be good parents or we need to have good society resources, that there is no age when the brain development is just dormant and not undergoing dramatic changes. And so we need to think of brain development as really occurring throughout childhood, teen years, even on into the early 20s. And that the cost for these early interventions, I think, will way outweigh the cost will be well spent in terms of that if we wait and don't treat these issues in young children, that society will pay much more down the road, and not to mention the cost to the individuals with these illnesses.
For Dr. Jay Geed, Atlantic City, New Jersey, thanks for waiting.
Hi. I have a wonderful brother who for 5 years has showed every symptom of bipolar disorder. He will not consider medication, and I was wondering, is there anything I can do to encourage him to take medication for his disorder?
Doctor, how do you get people moving in the right direction in terms of treatment?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the resistance is quite common, and particularly one of the aspects of bipolar disorder can be this feeling of elation and boundless energy, and the feeling is often unpleasant for many children, but for some it's not. And to try to convince them to take a medicine that will help them make better decisions, but not make them feel as energized, it can be a very difficult sell. And the first point is kind of goes back to the previous caller's comments. Are we sure that this is bipolar? Are we sure there aren't other factors leading to this? But if we're reasonably certain of the diagnosis, often if you can make an agreement to at least try the medicines and to give them a try to see if they'll be safe and they'll be effective, that once that initial trial phase is undertaken, then people can see for themselves the benefits of the medicines. But you're exactly right that often that first step is the most difficult. And that sometimes it helps to go over the information in terms of how it's been helpful for people. But what often works much better than the doctors saying that is for people to learn from support groups or from other people with the illness or the disorders to share their experiences and their, whether they've had good or bad experiences with the medicines or what has worked for them or has not worked for them. And many people find that a lot more palatable than having somebody tell them what to do. But if they can get in contact with others who share the situation, which is so much easier these days with the internet and with the ability to connect, across wide boundaries, even across countries and coast to coast, that can be very effective to get people to learn more about their disorder.
That being said, Doctor, are there special connections that NIMH makes with the states, the localities, even the schools in this area?
Probably the best conduit for that is the websites that we've heard how to contact before, in terms of a very good starting place in order to then branch out to see the resources that are available. But frankly, that could be an area that we might be able to do better in terms of being able to disseminate the information from our research to the parents and to the mental health professionals more effectively than we have.
Denver, Colorado. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for C-SPAN and this subject particularly.
Sure.
It's I'm calling about probably a threefold question. First, post-traumatic stress disorder in children, and trying to identify things that are getting submerged and maybe acted out as something other than just this is a 5-year-old acting out. And if there are any studies being done with MRIs to actually be able to see what is happening in the brain for children or others with that. But also from the other question is about, from my family standpoint, is a multi-generational problem with major depression. And any genetic studies or MRI studies being done with children in that regard.
Doctor.
Yeah, so for the first point, post-traumatic stress disorder, and Dr. Charney, who was just here being the world leading expert in that area, is conducting imaging studies of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the studies that have been done, as you suspected do show powerful changes related to early abuse, whether that abuse is physical, or social, or sexual, or emotional type of abuse. They all do seem to have effects, especially if the abuse occurs before the age of 5, and that these may create some longer lasting effects in the brain wiring and even in the brain anatomy. So that's an area that is very active and could lead to suggestions about how to deal with these problems. Do we want the children to talk it out and to relive it again and again, or do we want them more to put it aside and go on with other things? What sort of therapies might be most useful? And perhaps the technologies and the imaging technologies can help monitor the effects of the interventions and suggest new types of interventions. But it's hard to overstate the impact that these early life experiences can have, not just on them as children, but throughout the rest of their lives.
We go to Sterling. Go ahead, doctor. Sorry.
The other question regarding the family history and the genetics of depression, again, an area that is really so exciting right now in terms of all of the advances that are being made almost on a monthly basis in terms of identifying which genes or which factors might lead to different types of depression, and how we can understand what depression does to the brain, and how to understand what is the result of the stress that we get from having depression or anxiety, and the effects of cortisol or these other so-called stress hormones on what they do to the brain and long-term effects. It's an exciting time because it hasn't been that long that we've been actually able to capture these brain changes, and we're right at this sort of threshold now of being able to see what might matter in interventions and how we can go from observing the changes to doing something about it.
Moving on to Sterling, Virginia now. What would you like to say?
Yes, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I worked for many years with children and parents. And one of the most distressing things here is when one really looks at the problems associated with the diagnostic methods we use. There are serious problems. For instance, with ADHD, there are very few studies, if any, and I'd like to know if you know of any, where they control for the environment when they're looking at imaging techniques. And we know that the environment does play a very important role in the imaging. There are studies showing that the imaging techniques are affected by this. Also, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual lists criteria that can be due to many different causes, and this is for ADHD. And then I just wanted to mention an area that my dissertation was on. I work a lot with children with learning disorders. The Wechsler Intelligence Scale is widely used as the predominant criteria for determining this disorder, and yet it's based on face validity. Basically, that's one's best hunches. Every psychologist could have a different hunch as to what this particular difficulty or learning disorder might be. Studies have demonstrated that we cannot differentiate learning disabled children from emotionally disordered children, physically disabled children, or normal controls, and yet parents pay thousands of dollars to have children diagnosed with this test, and not nearly enough attention is given. One other thing, achievement tests have not been able to, using factor analysis, we've not been able to differentiate learning disorders.
Thanks, caller. You laid a lot out there. Let's see if the doctor has anything to say.
Yeah, and in some ways, the search for the better diagnostic tools is the holy grail of child psychiatry, and I guess psychiatry in general. In terms of, to use the example of ADHD, we need 6 of 9 symptoms of hyperactivity or 6 of 9 symptoms of inattention, but all of the symptoms are things that all children do sometimes. But we're asked to decide, is this more often than average? And which is it's an inherently sort of subjective type of thing to have to do. And this yearning then to say, could we do a brain image? Could we do an EEG? Could we do a lab test or some sort of computer test to know once and for all, does the child not have ADHD? And the unfortunate reality for us is we don't think so. We don't think there's anything out there that does better than struggling with these sort of subjective thresholds and talking to teachers and to parents and to the children themselves. We certainly haven't, given up hope. But if we could have some more objective measures, it would be great. But we run into this problem where, on group average, there's these robust differences, but not to the point where we can do an individual test and say whether the child has any of the psychiatric illnesses that I know of. There is no lab test for any of the psychiatric illnesses. Almost by definition, in a way, in terms of if we did do that, it would probably be neurology or some other specialty. But it's one of the great challenges that we really work on in terms of how can we help you and other mental health professionals to get around some of the subjectivity and really help to identify diagnostic features that may then suggest different treatment options or different outcomes. And we feel that we're in the thrill of the hunt in terms of we've made so much progress in this area of identifying the genetic and other biologic bases. And I think it's going to be happening in the near future in terms of being able to answer your question with some more specific steps about which tests and which interventions to attempt.
Dr. Jay Geed is child psychiatrist, and he's with the National Institute of Mental Health. We thank you as well for your time this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate all of your calls. We'll be back at 7 o'clock tomorrow.